Joining us now is Director Michael Casey. He is head of the National Counterintelligence and Security Center, joining us from up in the Washington area. It's so nice to see you, Mr. Director. Thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me, Suzanne. It's a great opportunity for us. Really appreciate it.
I really feel like this is a topic that doesn't get enough press when you're dealing with national security issues, and that is threats to the startup ecosystem. As a startup CEO myself, I understand completely how difficult it is to go get funding for a project where you have to build a team. You also have to be focused on the technology. These are a lot of tech startups that you're worried about, bringing the team together, all sorts of things. So I can understand why CEOs in some situations might be willing to take the money, not spend a lot of time on where it's coming from. But you're concerned about that at NCSC. Can you give me a little background as to why?
Sure, absolutely. First, just for those folks who may not know what we do, we're part of ODNI. We're the coordinator for all things security and counterintelligence across the intelligence community. So we do everything from security clearance reform to SCIF standards to coordination of counterintelligence activities. We do everything except the operational part. So we always say, like, if you see our folks chasing a spy down the street, something's gone really wrong. But one of the things we are charged with doing is outreach to the private sector, and we do a lot, and increasing amount of outreach to the private sector, sort of warning them of counterintelligence risks and threats. And in this context, one of the things that we have seen is, we call it foreign malign investment, because it has to be foreign malign something. Because we're the counterintelligence people. So, and we really need a good acronym, and FMI is pretty good. We see, in particular, the People's Republic of China encouraging Chinese venture capitals and sort of other investors to come invest in U.S. startups for emerging tech, and then sort of, sometimes take the IP and go back to China and start a competing company. And in the long run, look, if they were just investing in companies and competing with us, that's fine. But they're free to do that. But we also see them, blending this with some of their other more traditional espionage activities. And look, in the long run, the U.S. system is based on our ability to dominate in the tech sphere. And I think frankly, the Chinese figured that out some years back, and they really want to build competition with us. They would like to displace us in that realm. They certainly see our lead in technology as the basis for what is the best economy in the world, with the strongest military and the ability to sort of set tech standards and norms around the world. And they want it, and they have come up with a variety of tactics to try and go get that. Yeah. And so we whether it's foreign malign investment or providing advice to startups or a bunch of other kinds of outreach, we have spent a lot of time, and it's kind of a growth business, pushing back on that.
I can imagine, especially with all the innovation happening out there in the private sector, which is just massive amounts. So let me ask you, how does this work? Do Chinese investors who may be working with or for the Chinese government and have an interest in a particular technology have to actually go through with the investment? Do they have to actually invest money in the companies?
Yeah, that's a really good question. They don't always. A lot of the problems we see are sort of in the due diligence phase, where they are looking at investing in a company, and they come ask a lot of questions. And in some cases, we've seen them invest a little bit of money and then not follow through on the full acquisition once they get access to the IP. There's a great example, and we use it all the time because the company talks about it in public. It's actually a British company. There's an aeronautical engineering company called Smiths Harlow, I think. And we use this all the time, and I should be better about remembering the name of it. But the company was interested in essentially selling itself. A Chinese bidder offered about $10 million for it, provided somewhere just short of $4 million as an initial investment, got access to all the IP, and then disappeared and set up a competing company in China. Never went through with the acquisition. And so the British company is now left with, they've lost their IP, they've got a competitor who's got the exact same thing operating out of China. And oh, by the way, because they took that for roughly $4 million, they're losing contracts with the British government because they now have $4 million of Chinese money sitting there. You can't do business with the Ministry of Defense in that case. And so it's a multitude of risks in there. We've seen other cases where they do go through with the investment and then disappear with it. So it's across the board, and it's a real problem for us.
So almost really buying stuff that they usually would spy for in a way. It's kind of like changing the marketplace of espionage in a way.
100%. They are definitely interested in getting it however they can.
Yeah. What are you telling these young stars? You mentioned the NCSC. One of your biggest responsibilities is outreach and informing folks about some of the risks that are out there so they can navigate this a little bit more, I guess, intelligently. What are you telling young startup CEOs and those looking to raise money about how to vet for something like this? I mean, it's not like they have it on their calling card.
No, it's not. It would be a lot easier if everybody was just upfront about why they were doing it. I'm from the Chinese government. I'm here to help, which, shockingly enough, no one ever says. We tell them a lot of things. Like, one, just understand what your crown jewels are and be a little careful of them. Due diligence is one thing. Giving everybody your crown jewels to prove how cool they are is probably something else. So, like, be a little considerate about that. To the extent you can, do due diligence. Some cases it's not that hard to actually figure out who the investors are. We talk to some venture capital firms as well, who and kind of say to them, look, when you're investing in a company, you may want to look at who the other investors are, and when you're doing A, B, C rounds, whatever, and you have bidders, like, it's in your interest to also help the small startups vet those bidders. And typically venture capitalist private equity firms have a lot more capability of doing that, or at least more resources they can put towards it, for obvious reasons. If you invest in a startup and it fails because somebody stole the IP, you've lost your investment too. And oh, by the way, your business case in the future might be doing business with the United States government. That's not going to be so easy, even if they don't get ripped off, if they have 20% owned by a Chinese state affiliated entity. And so it's honestly fairly basic advice. We think it's pretty straightforward and something people should be thinking about as they look to grow.
Yeah. There's also, I think, it's fascinating because every time the government comes up with a way to protect something, adversaries come up with ways to hack it. And so on the cyber side as well, the North Koreans are doing some interesting things, kind of posing as venture capitalists, but they've got a slightly different technique. Can you explain that to me?
Sure. That's a little bit more like a way of getting people to click on the ransomware link, right? Like, so they pose as a venture capitalists, they want to do some of the due diligence. They set up a virtual meeting. Typically, this is how it would work. You set up a virtual meeting, and the venture capitalist doesn't show up on the other side, and so the company emails and says, like, "Hey, what's going on? I thought we had this meeting," and they get an email back that says, "Oh, sorry, something's technically gone wrong. Click on this link," and it'll make the Zoom work or the Teams or whatever the software is, and you click on that link, and lo and behold, it's malware of some kind, either ransomware, and then you're busy paying to get your data back, or it's malware and they steal your data. And it's pretty clever. You're taking all of this is built on taking advantage of people who are desperate for funding of one sort or another to make their good idea into a super successful company. And so it's all bad for us.
Once you're inside that circle of trust, which you kind of would be if you've already started conversations with potential investors, why wouldn't you think twice about clicking a link for a meeting that didn't work? That's just, it's amazing.
How many times has that happened to you where you've had a technical problem and, somebody just texts and says, like, "Hey, sorry, but we'll get this set up." It's not.
Yep. That's absolutely right. More times than I care to remember. So as sort of all of these different tech ecosystems are really undergoing attack here, NCSC has taken part in developing what you're calling secure innovation materials.
Yep.
Can you talk me through like what that is, and probably what everybody listening wants to know? How do they access them?
Oh, sure.
Is the link safe to click?
That link you can click on. We will probably not text it to you, however.
Good.
It is, however, on our website, which is undergoing a refresh, so hopefully it will be even better in a couple weeks. At the moment, it's a little, we're ODNI. We don't do a lot of websites, but we're refreshing it and should make
We
it
do
better.
intelligence. That's right.
Yeah, and the prioritization list, it turns out website fell a little low, but we're fixing that. What Secure Innovation was is literally it grew out of an idea that the Brits came up with, probably a year and a half ago, 2 years ago now, of look, we all the Five Eyes are seeing essentially the same thing, which is foreign, the hard targets, the PRC, Russia, to a lesser extent, Iran and North Korea, are all coming after our emerging tech companies. And when we crack down on it, that you see the malign actors go to Europe, they go to England, and they try it there, and it kind of ebbs and flows. But we're all seeing the same problem, and we all have the same concern. And so it was an idea: shouldn't we collectively, and this is the first time we've done this collectively, so it's a really good idea. But the five of us collectively put out sort of a suite of materials that are designed to sort of help highlight the threats and help emerging tech companies think through what they can do about them. And so it's effectively like sort of 5 steps, which is, know your threats, right? Like literally sit down and think, how can the bad guys come after my company? Everybody thinks about cyber, but there's insider threats. There's the malign investment we're talking about. There's a host of things. Secure your business, which is, think about how to build security into your corporate structure. One of the things we talk about all the time is don't take it for granted. Don't just assume you put in the virus protection software, but actually think through who's in charge of security, how do they relate to the corporate leadership to the extent an emerging tech startup has it. But be very thoughtful about this from the beginning. Secure your products, which is, most of these emerging tech companies, not all, but a lot of them are software facing and, building software products. And it is a lot easier to build security in from the beginning and think about that and think about the systems you're building them on and secure them from the beginning than it is to try and build it in a lot later. The other ones are secure your growth. So we were talking about, again, malign investment as you go through and try to get additional investors, you really have to think through who those people are. And then as you sort of go overseas and start thinking about, I want to expand markets, what are those additional risks that you're taking as you're exposed to other people's legal regimes or we talk about PRC a lot because it is the pacing threat, and frankly, picking on them is kind of what we do, for a good cause and in a good way. But if you were to try and set up business in the PRC, they have laws saying you have to cooperate with the intelligence community. They have cracked down on all sorts of U.S. companies trying to do business there for things that we think of as just normal business activities. So, think through where you're going to expand. Think through what the legal threats are and what the environment is there and what your competitors have there. And then out of all this, too, with one other step, which is secure your partnerships, which is really a lot of thinking through your supply chain. Because we see risks and foreign adversaries taking advantage of that, too, whether it's it was a little bit, the SolarWinds is sort of the iconical example of how a supply chain can go horribly wrong and really affect your company. And so we put these materials out with our Five Eye partners. All of them have a lot more information and steps behind it. And honestly, the whole idea is, it's fairly simple to a lot of your more sophisticated listeners, but really just to sit down and think strategically, step by step, what are those things I have to worry about? And what can I do about it? And at every step, what are the things I have to worry about? It turns out a lot of these guys just never really had a checklist. And I don't want to simplify it too much because a lot of work has gone into this and a lot of people have looked at it and contributed to it. But it's really you're a Silicon Valley guy. What are those things you have to worry about that you probably didn't cover in business school?
Exactly right. I feel like that's why a checklist is such a fantastic way to communicate because most CEOs I know are ADD, myself included. And if you just provide them with something, they don't have to try to pan the universe and figure it all out themselves.
It's not a wheel that has to be reinvented every time.
Yeah,
The
exactly
same
right.
concerns apply. So,
And you mentioned Five Eyes. I know that everybody listening
oh yeah,
to
of
this
course, right.
conversation knows exactly what the Five
Yeah,
Eyes are, but it's this intelligence
yeah.
gathering of New Zealand, Australia, Canada, UK, the US. Mostly, I just wanted to show you and impress you that
It's like yeah,
saw them all.
right. No, exactly. We work. Those are our closest partners. We work with them all the time. I don't think a week goes by that we don't have 3 meetings with that group about something. And so this was a natural point of collaboration for us, and
Yeah.
they're
And it's
fantastic.
not surprising that a lot of these threats would be directed at more than the US, that it would also be those like-minded partners.
Absolutely. I mean, the one thing you can say about the adversary is they are perfectly willing to go wherever they have to get what they need and do whatever they have to do to get it. Some level you admire their dedication to the goal. Certainly provides me with a full-time job.
Yeah.
So, and I always joke a little bit of a growth business, which I'm not sure I realized when I took this job.
Yeah, that it would be this much of a growth business.
Right. We could have been a little slower. It's fine. Right? Really
Yeah.
didn't need that much market share in that counterintelligence space. But no, they are the PRC and the Russians and everyone else are perfectly willing if there is a piece of IP they want or a secret they want to get and they can't get it here. They're perfectly willing to go to Canada or England, and we see that all the time. And fortunately, so do they. And that provides a basis for some pretty good cooperation.
Yeah, it's a fantastic alliance, and as I mentioned, I think most people on the call, listening
Yeah.
to this conversation, know what that is. But not to really give any more heartburn to potential young entrepreneurs out there about things they do need to be thinking about. But these aren't the only ways that adversaries are using your company to get information. There's also something we haven't talked about yet, which is the insider threat.
Right.
I mean, that's a difficult one. We talk with a lot of folks with deep experience at CIA, NSA, other places like that about trying to detect and then mitigate insider threats. You have some kind of practical advice for people on that topic as well, who aren't from the NSA or CIA and need that checklist. What are you advising when it comes to sort of understanding the threat from insider risk and then how to try to mitigate that as you're building your team?
Yeah. So the threat is, as you say, pretty easy to state actually, which is, you know, you hire an insider, they take your IP, they flee somewhere and try and set up another company. And this happens to companies up and down the food chain. It's not just the early tech guys. So I think it's like Apple's been hit like 3 times. I mean, like just when they were doing an autonomous vehicle program, I think they got hit 3 times. And Google's been hit a couple times, maybe 3. These are fairly sophisticated companies that fairly large with a lot of resources, and that's still a huge problem for them. And ultimately, the insider is dangerous because you let them in, you trust them, and you give them access to things, and then they just walk out the front door with a thumb drive or a laptop full of secrets. I mean, we tell people to again, it's not rocket science, but be cautious about, one, who you're hiring and who you're doing business with, and 2, think about it's like literally think about what do you have to protect and who you're giving access to. Mm-hmm. And do you have to give everybody access to all the core IP of your, widget that you're building or your piece of software? Can I limit exposure to that in a real way? And again, it goes back to a lot of this is just advising people of what's the security mindset I have to have? How do I think about the things people would come get me? And what can I do to hedge my bets? How do I build my corporate structure in a way that lets me best protect those? So things like, have a senior level security person who reports to, we always say like to the C-suite, to the CEO, because if they're 3 levels down in the HR, the general counsel department, then they're not reporting what the real threats are, and people aren't making hard calls. Again, none of this is particularly. It's not like talking about it and thinking about the threat is not particularly rocket science. Yeah. None of these things are also magic wands that are going to solve it, but it can at least hedge the bet. And it's a little bit like the burglar alarm. The burglar alarm isn't going to stop, the super high end art thief from coming in your front door, but it's going to make the average thief look at the next house, not your house.
Yeah.
So how do you we're trying to give advice of how you best not get hit.
And do you give the advice too of sort of like wargaming? I mean, it's something that I think forces you to think in ways that you don't when you're looking at strategy on paper.
You're exactly
But
right.
once, yeah, talk to me a little bit about your thoughts on that.
Sure. Yeah, sure. Thank you for bringing it up. You're exactly right, and I should have mentioned it. We tell people to do this all the time. Like you should think about what your worst day is.
Yeah.
What happens if you got hit and your crown jewels disappeared? And then so how would you react to that? But then think backwards. Like, what are the ways you could have gotten hit, and how do you go that back and prevent them? And you should do that involving, if you're a company, all the people who would have a piece in this, whether it's HR, legal, or the security guys, or whoever, the engineers, whoever's got access to this or could be part of the reaction or part of the prevention. You should wargame it and show everybody what happens if this goes wrong, and then make everybody think through how do we not let this happen, and don't do it once. Like everybody wants to do the war game, and then we've got a perfect plan, and that'll be great for 10 years. That's not how that works. The adversary evolves, your corporate structure probably evolves, your company grows and shrinks, like all the things. Like, you need to do this on a fairly regular basis. I'm not every week. We would say do it every week because that's what we do, but you need to do it on a regular basis and not just hand wave at it.
It makes a lot of sense. I mean, if there was a Super Bowl of crises, you wouldn't want to be taking your team out to play on the Super Bowl day. You'd want to have a whole lot of practice ahead of time. It makes really perfect sense. So let me ask you, the message, I feel like the message is really clear to sort of the startup, CEOs who are trying to build the company, pull together the investors. You really are building a team of people to create a product that could have serious implications for national security or keeping secrets or whatever it might be. How are you getting, what kind of feedback and what's the reception been among the other investors? So the private equity, the venture capital, do they see the threat that exists, and are they hearing the message that you told us earlier? Hey, you could be losing money too based on who's on your team if you don't know.
Yeah, generally speaking, we've gotten pretty good reaction. We've done this. Roadshow is too strong a word, but we've gone and talked to various groups of investors in New York and Silicon Valley, and we've done a few remotely. And for the most part, like, the reaction is like, "Wow, that's we didn't." Yes, intellectually we know that people are out there trying to steal IP. You read about it in the Wall Street Journal or whatever, but it really brings home. And there's an appetite for what do we do about it. And so I think even on that side, there's been some, thank you for saying this. Here's some things you can do to protect your investment. In general, I think we're seeing over the last 5 to 10 years a lot more awareness of this as a problem. I think 5 to 10 years ago, if you said the PRC is going to show up and try and steal all your secrets and do bad things to your company, you got some version of like, really? Is that true? And now you get much more of the like, help me deal with it. So we've been generally pretty pleased about that reaction. And to that point of more people being aware of it, I mean, we do see on the VC side more and more of them sort of trying to do a little bit of themselves. Mm-hmm. So we've seen a couple things, like there's a few venture capital firms who've gotten together and sort of, effectively said, we're going to lay out some security we want all of our companies to take, and here's sort of the kinds of investors we're not going to let in, and sort of really establish some pretty good standards like that. I think we're hoping more join that effort. We've seen discussions of, particularly in Silicon Valley, some of the venture capital firms changing their term sheets to build in security, which is like huge.
Wow,
I should give a thanks to the FBI, who's done a lot of outreach, particularly in the Silicon Valley. They've spent a lot of time with the venture capital guys and the emerging tech guys, really hammering home that message, and gotten some really good cooperation. So as much as I'd like to say it's all NCSC, it's really not. It's a team sport, and those guys have been fantastic in this.
Yeah. So what are some of the other resources? You mentioned ncsc.gov, I think is a place where you can go to kind of get your hands on these or eyes on. some of the checklists that you
Right.
mentioned, and probably an explanation of these threats as well, and put them into some context for folks. What are some of the other things that people could be doing? I mean, should they be establishing relationships? The last thing you ever want to do is have to call the FBI if something did go
It's a
wrong. But
lot, yeah, but it's a lot easier call if you already know them and they already know you.
exactly,
And so
exactly.
that is absolutely one of the things we suggest is that, the FBI has offices everywhere. Go introduce yourself and establish a relationship. They are interested in helping companies and helping educate about the threats.
Hmm.
It shouldn't, again, it shouldn't just be part of the war game of like, oh, everything went wrong. Now we call the FBI.
Yeah.
That should be a relationship that people already have. So
Yeah.
that is frankly the easiest way of doing it. You also see we've seen certain sectors start to self-organize a little bit. So you see sort of industrial associations start sharing resources. You see it in like the example we always use is a couple years ago. I was in the computer industry. It was an industry, obviously, a lot of our adversaries have interest in. And we and the FBI and everybody else had done 1,000 threat briefs for them. And at some point, their CISOs decided to self-organize and build and start sharing information and kind of build an organization for sharing best practices. And that's really, that kind of thing's been very helpful. You see it in a few places, but I think that's also sort of a growth. There's some growth in that, and that it does a lot of things. One, they are much more aware of what they're seeing on the ground than I am. I mean, as you point out, I'm sitting in Washington, and it's, obviously all knowledge flows into Washington, and we're,
Obviously.
right, like clearly know exactly what's going on the ground. Every startup in Silicon Valley, that is not true. But when you have an industry association, they really do feel it a lot more, and they can exchange some pretty practical advice. And then it's also a great way for on the Fed side to interact. So it's easier to hit 1,000 companies if they're all part of the same association. It will shock you that I do not have enough people to go visit 1,000 companies. I don't have enough people to visit 100 companies. So anything we can do, or the FBI can use as a force multiplier for getting that messaging out, and then getting feedback from them about what they're seeing and what really works. Those are all great resources. So
That makes a lot of sense. I am interested in just kind of in our last 3 minutes here, that feedback loop. How much information do you actually get back from some of these CEOs or fill in the other letters, whatever you want? Like, how much do they give you back about threats that they've seen once you've started having these conversations?
hit and miss. In some cases, like some of the industry associations I was talking about, we get a fair amount, and they're pretty organized about it. In other cases, you get it when we go do one of our road shows, for lack of a better word, and it's a little anecdotal. We have some relationships with relationships of just long-standing personal relationships or professional relationships from people who worked in the IC or the FBI who then went and worked in whatever private sector industry now, and they give us some feedback. It's not honestly, it's not what I would really want in an ideal world. We'd really like to have a much more granular view of what he's seeing, but it's not certainly not zero. It is also a little, particularly with a lot of those personal relationships, a little self-selecting, and I'd really love to find a way to get a much broader view. And that's a little bit why we think those industry associations and that kind of channel is more important, because you get, I don't just get the former retired FBI guy who's the chief security officer. I also get the guy who has never really worked for the government, and I really want his view too and what they're saying.
Yeah.
So it's a constant fight for us, honestly, to get like the full view of across the world. But we're working on it. I mean, it is definitely a focus area for us.
Dr. Casey, since you've been in this role, I'm sure that you have had meetings with folks where it was a real eyebrow raiser when you shared some of what the government knows about threats to their industry or their particular sector. Were there any moments that you can recall that really surprised you, that you just didn't think, either the speed at which threats are emerging or how complicated the nature of the threats has gotten, anything like that?
I am amazed by the breadth of it, honestly. Like the number of things that if you had asked, again, I've worked in Washington my entire professional career. I've worked in national security. I think of, historically threats Also, in the admission of how old I am, I finished grad school like just after the Cold War, and so you come up with this, the obviously the bad guys are all after state secrets, and in fact, what the bad guys are after is literally everything. They have published big lists, whether it's made in China 2025 or the 14th or whatever we're on, 5-year plan with enormous lists of tech, and just the sheer scale and pace at which they're going after. And in some cases, frankly, just like the cleverness for how they're doing it. I mean, sort of blended operations, what we call blended operations, where it's both doing due diligence and then, insider threat and a cyber on top of it, cyber attack on top of it, all to get, one little piece of IP that they really, really want. Like it's frankly pretty impressive. As somebody who works in the IC, sometimes you kind of go, well, that was a pretty good op, actually. I mean, I got to give you credit. So it's less of a one particular anecdote and more of a, just this feeling, this wave of.
So I want to ask you the crystal ball question, which no one can ever answer because no one has a crystal ball, but I like to ask it anyway, which is, we've seen over the last, since the invasion of Ukraine, so over the last almost 3 years, it's hard to believe, this alliance, for lack of a better word, between particularly traditional U.S. adversaries, so Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, all of them particularly talented when it comes to technologies. What we've talked about in this conversation so far has been a lot of the efforts you're seeing from China, but are you worried that there might be more cooperation or collaboration among those 4 particular nations in launching some of these espionage operations?
Yes, this is where we say, yes, we are very worried about that. I think what we've seen so far is, and I say this as the director of NCSC, not a professional analyst, so with that caveat out of the way, what you've generally seen is a lot of cooperation on the military side, some initial cooperation on the intel side, because no intel agency really likes to cooperate with any other intel agency, including our own. Getting the CIA and the NSA to talk to each other is always like, it happens. They'll come to the meetings sometimes. But you definitely see some growth in that, and that's definitely really concerning. I think were the trends to continue for the next 10 years, I'd be extremely worried about that.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. All right, I have to ask you, and I told I had the privilege of interviewing the CIA Director William Burns at the Sea Island conference that the Cyber Brief holds each year in Sea Island.
And asked him in the past, so it's great.
Yes, that's right. You have been a speaker there as well. I have to ask him the question that I hate asking because it sounds so cheesy when you say it out loud, but it's kind of important. What is the one thing that keeps you up at night?
There's only one? I only get one thing that keeps me up at night?
I might give you 3.
Yeah, the thing that mostly keeps me up at night is that that on our side, we take our eye off the ball. It's not, we know what the adversary's doing, even if it's at a scope and scale and pace that makes it hard. Like, we know what they're doing. We know, we can raise a level of threat awareness. We can help people with security. We can do all those things. But if we take our eye off the ball, we're going to lose. And that's just the reality of it. We can and have and should and will continue pushing back on the adversary and protecting our secrets and our way of life. The easiest way to lose this competition is for us to quit fighting it. And so we can't afford to do that. We have to keep doing what we're doing and doing more of it. And it is a collective thing. This is not something that can just be the United States government. It will shock everyone listening to this that I cannot protect every company by myself. I can't protect, we can barely protect the United States government all by ourselves. And it's not just a United States government problem. Like, even we and the FBI can't do it together. It is corporate America has to do it. They have to help. And we just can't. None of us can let up on that.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point.
A lot of the simple thing that keeps me awake at 2:00 in the morning.
Just little things like that are so easy to solve.
It's fine.
Well, I think that NCSC has taken an important first step here. Once again, for those listening, if you'd like to access what NCSC has for you on the secure innovation access materials, some of those checklists you talked about. I'm assuming maybe some guidelines for some of the war games. If not, you have contact information on your website at ncsc.gov. What have I not asked you that you really, really wanted to talk about?
Oh gosh, I mean, in this space, this has been good. Not asked. The one thing I would plead with the listeners for is going back to the feedback conversation,
Yeah.
particularly in some of the areas we touched on. So one that's been a little bit of a consternation, difficulty for us is like we were talking about before, the insider threat and what people see there. We have started, basically because people have asked us to come talk to various companies and associations about insider threats. NCSC is, for background, we're charged with managing, or overseeing, I guess, managing is the wrong word, the nation's insider threat program for government agencies. But we have wildly different authorities and constraints than private sector folks, particularly international businesses who do business across the globe. And I think there is, from the Mike Casey standpoint, like a real need for all of us to do more on that. And we really need effectively a better conversation with the private sector about what they're seeing and what they see as their constraints and the kinds of problems they're seeing. It is comparatively relatively easy for the United States government to do insider threat, right? We can take away somebody's security clearance. We can, they're all U.S. citizens. They all signed up for this. We can monitor all your computers. We can, say you can't travel to certain places. There's a lot of authorities we have that private sector folks don't, and that's something I'd really think that the center should get better at over the next couple of years. Both understanding what the private sector sees and then figuring out better ways to help them. So,
That's a big challenge.
yeah,
Definitely.
it's really complicated. It's actually super
Boy,
rich.
and it feels like national security is not going to get any less complicated in the next several years. So, yeah, we appreciate the conversation. Michael Casey is director of the National Counterintelligence and Security Center. And once again, the website is ncsc.org or .gov, sorry, .gov.
Right?
And
There probably is a .org. I don't know. I've never looked.
probably
It's
is.
not
I don't know. I don't know if it's legit, though. Now I don't want to click
That's
on
right. It's
anything.
phishing. Yeah, don't click on that link.
That's right. To look for those secure innovation access materials. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to have you on. And really, I think enlightening when we're understanding how the dynamics of this threat are changing, and how they might be really reaching a lot closer to home than people thought when you're talking about your own startup. So thank you so much for the conversation, Mr. Director. It's great to see you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's great to see you too. Look forward to the next CI event.
Me too.
Okay.